old-fashioned farm was a great place to play, and that's what Fern and her brother are doing today. In the meantime, the clock is running down on Charlotte's promise to save Wilbur's life. Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, illustrated by Garth Williams, published by Harper's. That morning, just as Wilbur fell asleep, Avery Arable wandered into the Zuckermans' front yard, followed by Fern. Avery carried a live frog in his hand. Fern had a crown of daisies in her hair. The children ran for the kitchen. "Just in time for a piece of blueberry pie," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "Look at my frog," said Avery, placing the frog on the drain board and holding out his hand for pie. "Take that thing out of here," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "He's hot," said Fern. "He's almost dead, that frog." "He is not," said Avery. "He lets me scratch him between the eyes." The frog jumped and landed in Mrs. Zuckerman's dishpan full of soapy water. "You're getting your pie on you," said Fern. "Can I look for eggs in the hen house, Aunt Edith?" "Run outdoors, both of you, and don't bother the hens." "It's getting all over everything," shouted Fern. "His pie is all over his front." "Come on, frog," cried Avery. He scooped up his frog. The frog kicked, splashing soapy water onto the blueberry pie. "Another crisis," groaned Fern. "Let's swing in the swing," said Avery. The children ran to the barn. Mr. Zuckerman had the best swing in the county. It was a single long piece of heavy rope tied to the beam over the north doorway. At the bottom end of the rope was a fat knot to sit on. It was arranged so that you could swing without being pushed. You climbed a ladder to the hayloft. Then, holding the rope, you stood at the edge and looked down and were scared and dizzy. Then you straddled the knot so it acted as a seat. Then you got up all your nerve, took a deep breath, and jumped. For a second, you seemed to be falling to the barn floor far below, but then suddenly the rope would begin to catch you, and you would sail through the barn door going a mile a minute, with the wind whistling in your eyes and ears and hair. And then you would zoom upwards toward the sky and look up at the clouds, and the rope would twist, and you would twist and turn with the rope. Then you would drop down, 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 down out of the sky and come sailing back into the barn, almost into the hayloft, and then sail out again, not quite so far this time, then in again, not quite so high, and then out again and in again, and then out, then in, and then you'd jump off and fall down and let somebody else try it. Mothers for miles around worried about Zuckerman's swing. They feared some child would fall off, but no child ever did. Children will almost always hang on to things tighter than their parents think they will. Avery put the frog in his pocket and climbed to the hayloft. "The last time I swung on this swing, I almost crashed into a barn swallow," he yelled. "Take that frog out," ordered Fern. Avery straddled the rope and jumped. He sailed out through the door, frog and all, and into the sky, frog and all. Then he sailed back into the barn. "Your tongue is purple," screamed Fern. "So is yours," cried Avery, sailing out with the frog. "I have hay inside my dress. It itches," called Fern. "Scratch it," yelled Avery as he sailed back. "It's my turn," said Fern. "Jump off." "Fern's got the itch," sang Avery. When he jumped off, he threw the swing up to his sister. She shut her eyes tight and jumped. She felt the dizzy drop and then the supporting lift of the swing. When she opened her eyes, she was looking up at the blue sky and was about to fly back through the door. They took turns for an hour. When the children grew tired of picking, they went down towards the pasture and picked wild raspberries and ate them. Their tongues turned from purple to red. Fern bit into a raspberry that had a bad-tasting bug inside and got discouraged. Avery found an empty candy box and put his frog in it. The frog seemed tired after his morning in the swing. The children walked slowly up to the barn. They, too, were tired and hardly had energy enough to walk. "Let's build a tree house," suggested Avery. "I want to live in a tree with my frog." I'm going to visit Wilbur, Fern announced. They climbed up the fence into the lane and walked lazily towards the pig pen. Wilbur heard them coming and got up. Avery noticed the spider web. Coming closer, he saw Charlotte. "Hey, look at that big spider," he said. "It's tremendous." "Leave it alone," commanded Fern. "You've got a frog. Isn't that enough?" "It's a fine spider, and I'm going to capture it," said Avery. He took the cover off the candy box. Then he picked up a stick. "I'm going to knock that old spider into this box," he said. Wilbur's heart almost stopped when he saw what was going on. This might be the end of Charlotte if the boy succeeded in catching her. Avery put one leg over the fence of the pig pen. "You stop it, Avery!" cried Fern. He was just about to raise his stick to hit Charlotte when he lost his balance. He swayed and toppled and landed on the edge of Wilbur's trough. The trough tipped up and then came down with a slap. The goose egg was right underneath. There was a dull explosion as the egg broke, and then a horrible smell. "Ah!" Fern screamed. Avery jumped to his feet. The air was filled with the terrible gases and smells from the rotten egg. Templeton, who had been resting in his home, scuttled away from the barn. "Good night!" screamed Avery. "Good night! What a stink! Let's get out of here!" Fern was crying. She held her nose and ran towards the house. Avery ran after her, holding his nose. Charlotte felt greatly relieved to see them go. It had been a narrow escape. Later on that morning the animals came up from the pasture, the sheep, the lambs, the gander, the goose, and the 7 goslings. There were many complaints about the awful smell, and Wilbur had to tell the story over and over again, how the arable boy had tried to capture Charlotte, and how the smell of the broken egg drove him away just in time. "It was that rotten goose egg that saved Charlotte's life," said Wilbur. The goose was proud of her share in the adventure. "I'm delighted that egg never hatched," she gabbled. Templeton, of course, was miserable over the loss of his beloved egg, but he couldn't resist boasting. "It pays to save things," he said in a surly voice. "A rat never knows when something is going to come in handy. I never throw anything away." "Well," said one of the lambs, "this whole business is all well and good for Charlotte, but what about the rest of us? The smell is unbearable. Who wants to live in a barn perfumed with rotten egg?" "Don't worry," said Templeton. "You'll get used to it." He sat up and pulled wisely at his long whiskers, then crept away to pay a visit to the dump. When Lurvy showed up at lunchtime, carrying a pail of food for Wilbur, he stopped short a few paces from the pig pen. He sniffed the air and made a face. "What in thunder?" Setting the pail down, he picked up the stick that Avery had dropped and pried the trough up. "Rats," he said. "Phew! I might have known a rat would make a nest under this trough. How I hate a rat!" And Lurvy dragged Wilbur's trough across the yard and kicked some dirt into the rat's nest, burying the broken egg and all of Templeton's other possessions. Then he picked up the pail. Wilbur stood in the trough, drooling with hunger. Lurvy poured. The slops ran creamily down around the pig's eyes and ears. Wilbur grunted. He gulped and sucked and gulped and made swishing, swishing sounds, anxious to get everything at once. It was a delicious meal. Skim milk, wheat middlings, leftover pancakes, half a doughnut, a rind of summer squash, 2 pieces of stale toast, a third of a ginger snap, a fish tail, 1 orange peel, several noodles from a noodle soup, the scum off a cup of cocoa, an ancient jelly roll, a strip of paper from the lining of the garbage pail, and a spoonful of raspberry jello. Wilbur ate heartily. He planned to leave half a noodle and a few drops of milk for Templeton. Then he remembered that the rat had been useful in saving Charlotte's life, and that Charlotte was trying to save his life, so he left a whole noodle instead of a half. Now that the broken egg was buried, the air cleared and the barn smelled good again. The afternoon passed and the evening came. Shadows lengthened. The cool and kindly breath of the evening entered through the doors and windows. Astride her web, Charlotte sat moodily eating a horsefly and thinking about the future. After a while she bestirred herself. She descended to the center of the web, and there she began to cut some of her lines. She worked slowly but steadily as the other creatures drowsed. None of the others, not even the goose, noticed what she was at work. Deep in his soft bed Wilbur snoozed. Over in their favorite corner the goslings whistled a night song. Charlotte tore quite a section out of her web, leaving an open space in the middle. Then she started weaving something to take the place of the thread she had removed. When Templeton got back from the dump around midnight, the spider was still at work. The next chapter is called The Miracle. The next day was foggy. Everything on the farm was dripping wet. The grass looked like a magic carpet. The asparagus patch looked like a silver forest. On foggy mornings, Charlotte's web was truly a thing of beauty. Each morning, each thin strand was decorated with dozens of tiny beads of water. The web glistened in the light and made a pattern of loveliness and mystery, like a delicate veil. Even Lurvy, who wasn't particularly interested in beauty, noticed the web when it came with the pig's breakfast. He noticed how clearly it showed up, and he noted how big and carefully built it was. And then he took another look and saw something that made him sit his pail down. There, in the center of the web, neatly woven in black block letters, was a message. It said, "Some pig." Lurvy felt weak. He brushed his hand across his eyes and stared harder at Charlotte's web. "I'm seeing things," he whispered. He dropped to his knees and uttered a short prayer. Then, forgetting all about Wilbur's breakfast, he walked back to the house and called Mr. Zuckerman. "I think you better come down to the pig pen," he said. "What's the trouble?" said Mr. Zuckerman. "Anything wrong with the pig?" Not exactly," said Lurvy. Come and see for yourself." The two men walked silently down to Wilbur's yard. Lurvy pointed at the spider's web. "Do you see what I see?" he asked. Zuckerman stared at the writing on the web. Then he murmured the words, "Some pig." Then he looked at Lurvy. They both began to tremble. Charlotte, sleepy after a night's exertions, smiled as she watched. Wilbur came and stood directly under the web. "Some pig," murmured Lurvy in his low voice. "Some pig," whispered Mr. Zuckerman. They stared and stared for a long time at Wilbur. Then they stared at Charlotte. "You don't suppose that the spider," began Mr. Zuckerman. But he shook his head and didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he walked solemnly back to the house and spoke to his wife. "Edith, something has happened," he said in a weak voice. He went into the living room and sat down, and Mrs. Zuckerman followed. "I've got something to tell you, Edith," he said. "You better sit down." Mrs. Zuckerman sank into a chair. She looked pale and frightened. "Edith," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I think you best be told we have a very unusual pig." A look of complete bewilderment came over Mrs. Zuckerman's face. "Homer Zuckerman, what in the world are you talking about?" she said. "It's a very serious thing," he replied. "Edith, our pig is completely out of the ordinary." "What's so unusual about the pig?" asked Mr. Zuckerman, who began to recover from her scare. "Well, I don't really know yet," said Mr. Zuckerman. "But we have received a sign, Edith, a mysterious sign. A miracle has happened on this farm. There's a large spider's web in the door of the barn cellar, right over the pig pen, and when Lurvy went to feed the pig this morning, he noticed the web because it was foggy, and you know how a spider's web looks very distinct in a fog. And right there in the middle of the web were the words, "Some pig." The words were woven right into the web. They were actually part of the web, Edith, I know, because I've been down there and seen them. It says "Some pig," just as clear can be. There can be no mistake about it. A miracle has happened and a sign has occurred here on earth, right in our farm. We have no ordinary pig. "Well," said Mrs. Zuckerman, "seems to me we're a little off. It seems to me we have no ordinary spider." "Oh, no," said Mr. Zuckerman. "It's the pig that's unusual. It says so right in the middle of the web." "Maybe so," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "Just the same, I intend to have a look at that spider." What do you think they'll see when they get down there? We'll find out next time on Book Bites. I'm Miss Melissa from the Oosterhout Free Library. Remember, you can come in and check out a copy of Charlotte's Web and read along with us, or even read ahead if you want to.